The courtroom was hushed that morning, but no one expected a 9-year-old boy to walk in holding his mother's trembling hand. Little Ethan Miller stood close to her, his small fingers gripping her sleeve as if letting go would somehow make everything worse. His mother, Laura, looked exhausted, her eyes red, her shoulders heavy with the weight of a life she was barely holding together. Judge Caprio glanced toward the two, noticing the child first. His calm expression softened, but there was a seriousness in his eyes, an instinct that something wasn't right. Laura had been called in for several unpaid parking violations, but the judge sensed this wasn't just another routine case. Ethan stepped forward before his mother could speak. He wasn't tall enough to reach the microphone, but he tried anyway, stretching his neck, determined to be heard. The entire courtroom turned silent. Even Judge Caprio leaned in slightly, surprised by the courage of a child who looked like he should have been in school, not pleading in a courtroom. No one expected what came next. Ethan's voice cracked as he stood between the judge and his mother. He took a breath and spoke, not like a child complaining or scared, but like someone trying to protect the most important person in his world. "My mom, she didn't mean to break the rules," he said softly. "She was trying to get to work. I was sick that day. She didn't want to leave me alone." A subtle gasp moved across the room. Laura covered her mouth, fighting tears she could no longer hide. Judge Caprio paused, studying the boy, his courage, his honesty, and the way he stood like a small shield in front of his mother. Something had shifted. Everyone felt it, and the courtroom waited to see how the judge would respond. The courtroom in Providence was quieter than usual that morning, and Judge Caprio noticed it the moment he took his seat. There was a stillness in the air, as if the room itself sensed that something different was about to unfold. On the left side of the room sat Laura Miller, a young woman, her hands tightly clasped together. She looked exhausted, worn down by life, the kind of tired that didn't just come from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying burdens alone. Beside her stood her 9-year-old son, Ethan Miller. He was small, thin, and holding onto the edge of his mother's coat as if it were a lifeline. His eyes scanned the courtroom carefully, not with fear, but with a strange sort of alertness, the way children look when they're forced to grow up faster than they should. The clerk read out the case. Laura Miller, charged with multiple parking violations and a missed-court appearance. Laura rose slowly, but Ethan stayed close, refusing to move even half a step away from her. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and observed them for a moment before speaking. He had seen thousands of cases, but something about this pair struck him before they even said a word. Laura apologized immediately, her voice thin and strained. She explained that she had missed the court date while dealing with her second job and caring for Ethan. Her income barely kept them afloat. Rent, groceries, utilities, everything had become a monthly battle. The fines had stacked up during a period when their car was the only way she could get to work on time. When the tickets came, she set them aside, telling herself she would deal with them later. But later never came, because survival always took priority. Judge Caprio listened patiently. He could see she wasn't someone trying to dodge responsibility. She was simply drowning. Before he could ask another question, Ethan stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic or bold, just a small shift of his feet, but enough to draw the judge's attention. Laura gently tried to pull him back, but he shook his head subtly. Judge Caprio leaned forward. He asked Ethan what brought him to court today. Ethan replied that he didn't want his mom to come alone. He didn't want her to be scared. He'd seen her worry every night at the kitchen table, counting bills, choosing which ones she could pay and which ones had to wait. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to know she needed help. The courtroom grew unusually still. Even the prosecutor looked up from his papers. Laura quickly wiped her eyes and apologized, insisting that Ethan shouldn't have to explain their situation. But Ethan kept his gaze steady on the judge, as if trying to carry part of the weight his mother had been carrying alone. Judge Caprio observed them both. His many years on the bench had taught him that the truth of a case was often revealed not in legal documents, but in these small, honest moments. And in this moment, he saw a mother doing everything she could to keep her child safe, and a child try to protect his mother in return. Something deeper was going on, something unspoken, and he knew he needed to understand it before he made any decision. The tension inside the courtroom shifted the moment Ethan stepped back beside his mother. Laura tried to steady herself, but her hands continued to tremble. She kept her eyes low, hoping the judge wouldn't notice how shaken she was, but Judge Caprio had already seen enough to know something wasn't right. He leaned back slightly in his chair, observing the small family standing before him as if he were piecing together a puzzle they didn't know they had revealed. The prosecutor cleared his throat and read the charges: multiple parking violations, an expired registration, and a failure to appear that had triggered additional penalties. The total had now grown to an amount that was impossible for a struggling family to pay. Ethan stood close to his mother, holding the sleeve of her jacket gently, as though he feared she might fall without him. Laura apologized softly, explaining that she had missed the deadlines because she worked double shifts at the diner and couldn't get off work. She had no car insurance for a month because she had chosen to pay rent instead. Each word was quiet, controlled, almost rehearsed, as if she had spent nights preparing to explain her situation in the most respectful way possible. Judge Caprio listened carefully, but he could sense something deeper. Her voice carried exhaustion, but also something sharper: fear. He asked why the car was so important to her if keeping up with the fines and documents was becoming impossible. Laura hesitated. Ethan looked up at her, almost as if he expected her to stay silent, but she forced out a simple answer. She needed the car to get to work. The prosecutor added that one of the violations involved parking overnight near a hospital. That detail seemed to strike the judge more than the others. He gently asked why she was there so late. Laura swallowed hard, but before she could form a response, Ethan stepped forward again. This time his small voice trembled but did not break. He said they were at the hospital because his grandmother had been admitted repeatedly over the last few months. She had trouble breathing at night, and they would rush out whenever her condition worsened. The courtroom grew still. The judge nodded slowly. He asked how many times they had gone to the hospital. Ethan answered without overthinking. He kept count because he had been awake almost every night listening for his grandmother coughing. He remembered 6 times. Laura corrected him gently. It had been more. She had stopped telling him the exact number because she didn't want him worrying about missing school. Judge Caprio asked why she hadn't reached out for assistance or explained her situation earlier. Laura responded that she was embarrassed. She thought no one would believe her unless she had documents and proof, and she didn't want to look like she was making excuses. She had been waiting for her next paycheck to fix everything at once, but by then, the penalties had doubled. The prosecutor shifted, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of the situation. The charges on the sheet had been simple until now, but the human story behind them was anything but simple. He explained that the city regulations still required enforcement, but he acknowledged that circumstances were clearly influencing this case. Judge Caprio looked at Ethan again and noticed the boy pressing his lips together, fighting to stay composed. He asked Ethan what he thought about all this. The boy took a moment before speaking. He said he wished he were older so he could help his mom more. He said he never wanted to see her cry again. He said that if paying the fine would stop her from being scared, he would try to earn the money himself. The judge felt the room tighten emotionally. Ethan's voice was soft, but every person present heard him clearly. The sincerity in his words carried more weight than any legal argument could. The prosecutor looked down at his paperwork, pretending to recheck facts he already knew, perhaps out of respect for the moment. Judge Caprio folded his hands, leaned forward, and took a long breath. The case had become more than a list of violations. It was now a portrait of a family trying to survive, caught in circumstances that far exceeded their control. The rising pressure of the situation was now undeniable, and the judge knew the next step would determine not just the outcome of the case, but the emotional turning point for a young boy standing bravely in front of him. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and filled with intention. He asked Ethan one last question, one that would shift the entire trajectory of the moment, though neither mother nor son yet knew what was coming next. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, studying the young boy who had just placed himself between his mother and the weight of the law. Ethan stood there trembling, but determined, as if he had finally gathered the courage to reveal something he had been carrying for far too long. The courtroom was unusually silent, not out of fear, but because everyone sensed that something deeper was unfolding. The prosecutor, despite his strict posture, lowered his gaze slightly, recognizing that this case had drifted far from ordinary procedure. Laura tried to pull her son back to the defense table, whispering for him to sit down, but Ethan shook his head gently. He wasn't defiant. He was certain. Judge Caprio noticed this and softened his voice. He asked him what he meant by wanting to take responsibility. Ethan swallowed hard and tried to speak, but the words wavered. It wasn't the fear of punishment that stopped him, but the difficulty of explaining a truth he had never shared so openly. Judge Caprio then asked him again, calmly, encouraging him to express whatever he was holding inside. Ethan finally pointed to their situation at home. He explained how his mother had been working nights and cleaning mornings, how she was barely able to keep the lights on, and how the day of the violation had been one of the worst days they had experienced in months. The boy told the courtroom that his mother wasn't careless. She was exhausted from trying to support them alone. He described how she had fallen asleep at the wheel earlier that week and still insisted on going to work because missing a shift meant missing meals. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably as Ethan explained how he often skipped breakfast so his mother could eat something before she left for her shift. The words came slowly but clearly, and even Laura, who had remained composed until then, struggled to hold back tears. She tried again to stop him, but Judge Caprio gently shook his head, signaling that the boy should continue. He believed that the truth, once spoken, had a way of helping more than silence ever could. Ethan explained that on the day of the violation, they had been rushing because his mother had just received news that her paycheck had been delayed again. She had parked the car illegally, not out of disregard for the rules, but out of overwhelming stress. He described how frightened he had been watching her cry in the car afterward. He said he didn't want her to get into more trouble because he knew she was already carrying more than she could handle. Judge Caprio listened without interrupting. His expression carried a weight of compassion, as though he felt every word. He glanced at Laura, who stood frozen between pride and shame. The judge then turned to the prosecutor, but not to discuss the fine or the violation. Instead, he spoke about the humanity of the situation. He explained that the purpose of the court was not only to enforce rules, but also to understand the people behind them. He pointed out that sometimes the burden of life becomes heavier than the law was ever intended to be. The boy's confession changed the atmosphere completely. What had started as a routine case had transformed into a moment of truth, vulnerability, and bravery. Even the spectators who had arrived for routine hearings sat forward, drawn into the raw honesty pouring from a child who simply wanted to protect his mother. Judge Caprio then leaned closer, not with authority, but with sincerity, and asked Ethan a question that shifted the entire moment. What made him decide to speak now, despite being so afraid earlier? The boy replied that watching his mother tremble in front of the judge hurt more than any fine or punishment ever could. He said he wanted to help her the only way he knew how, by telling the truth. And in that moment, the turning point arrived. The judge realized that what stood before him was not a case, but a family trying desperately to survive. A mother stretched beyond her limits. A child who had grown up too fast. And a courtroom now holding its breath, waiting for his response. The courtroom fell into a deep, reflective silence after Ethan's confession. His small voice, trembling with fear, yet held together by love for his mother, lingered in the air like a fragile truth no one had expected to hear from a 9-year-old boy. Judge Caprio sat back for a moment, his expression softening into something between compassion and heartbreak. He glanced at Laura, who sat frozen, her face pale, eyes filled with the weight of years she had silently carried. He leaned forward again, his hands gently clasped on the bench. His tone was calmer now, filled with a warmth that wrapped around the room like a blanket. He spoke first to Ethan, acknowledging the bravery it took for someone so young to stand up in a courtroom and tell the truth. He told him that few adults had the courage he had shown, and that what he had done was something any mother would forever be proud of. Then he turned to Laura, addressing her with the same softness. He told her that life had clearly not been kind to her recently, but the strength she had shown raising a boy like Ethan said far more about her character than the charges ever could. He explained that the court was not meant to punish people already fighting life's hardest battles, but to understand them, guide them, and help them stand again. With slow, thoughtful words, Judge Caprio announced his decision. The fines would be waived, the late fees dismissed. The case would be closed with no penalties. He said the court saw not a careless mother, but a woman doing everything she could to care for her son. Laura covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face, her shoulders shaking as years of pressure began to melt away. Ethan moved closer to her, and she wrapped an arm around him, pulling him into her side as though she feared losing him. Judge Caprio watched them with gentle eyes. He told Laura that she should never feel ashamed for seeking help and that no one in the courtroom judged her for her struggles. He encouraged her to reach out to local programs designed to support families in difficult situations. He reminded her that her journey did not have to be a lonely one. Before concluding the case, he looked at Ethan once more. He told him that he had reminded every person in that room of what loyalty and love truly meant, and that sometimes it was the smallest voices that carried the greatest truths. Ethan nodded quietly, unsure how to respond, but his eyes glowed with a soft mix of pride and relief. As the case was officially closed, the tension dissolved. Laura whispered her gratitude through tears, and Ethan managed a small smile toward the bench. Judge Caprio offered them both a warm nod. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. Their burden had been lifted. Their fear was replaced with something they had not felt in a long time: hope. The courtroom slowly returned to its rhythm, but something about the moment lingered in the air, as if everyone present understood they had witnessed far more than a simple violation or a routine hearing. They had seen a young boy stand up for the person who mattered most to him, and a judge respond with the kind of compassion that reminded people why humanity still mattered. Ethan walked beside his mother as they made their way toward the exit, holding her hand with quiet pride. Laura looked lighter than when she had entered, as though the heavy burden she carried had finally eased for the first time in a long while. Behind them, Judge Caprio gently closed the file, but the expression on his face showed that the case had left a mark on him as well. He had seen thousands of defendants, countless stories, endless struggles, yet moments like this were the ones that stayed with him. They were reminders that every person who stood before him carried a life far larger than the citation written on the ticket. And sometimes, all they needed was a small moment of understanding to move forward again. As Ethan and Laura stepped out into the daylight, the doors closed behind them, but their story continued quietly within every viewer's heart. It became a reminder of courage, kindness, and the power of standing up for family, no matter how young or small you may be. If this story touched you, consider subscribing to more inspiring courtroom moments. Your support helps keep these true human stories alive, and we'll be here with another heartfelt case in the next video.